I'm so sorry. I completely forgot the second half of Lesson 7, so we'll call this Episode 7, Part 2.
Lutheran Reformation, Scene 7, Part 2, Mark.
I don't have it memorized, and I'm afraid we have to use an older technology for this episode. And so, can you turn off the lights? Okay, thank you. Now, where does this start? When analyzing church history, it's essential to recognize that none of it happened in a vacuum. Traditionally, the history of the church is divided into time periods, with the divisions marked by an event or distinct characteristic that shows an evolution in theology and/or institutions. The Reformation era is likely the most recognizable period and the easiest to pinpoint on a calendar. It begins in the 16th century with the arrival of Martin Luther and his posting of the 95 Theses. But in order to understand why Luther's arrival and writings had a monumental impact on the institutional church, theology, and society as a whole, one must understand the theological environment Luther was born into. With that in mind, it's informative to look at the theological framework that undergirded the notion of the institutional church, its structure, and its role in society. One of the simplest ways to get at this topic is to look at the work and teachings of Thomas Aquinas, who was and is to this day considered the doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. That is to say, Roman Catholic theology is beholden to his teaching. In his Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas argued for the necessity of the sacraments. The sacraments delivered grace to further a person's perfected being. This was actually coming out of the views of Cyprian and Augustine. Grace, then, is understood to be a substance that helps you become a better person or a more perfect person. You comfortable down there?
Now we're going to step back and look at the foundations of Aquinas' theology and the sources that formed his system of thought. In other episodes, we set forth the distinction in two ways of thinking theologically. As Luther described it, one can do theology ad modum scripturae, in the manner of Scripture, or ad modum Aristotelius, in the manner of Aristotle.
You have this memorized?
I wrote this episode, Chris. I know it pretty well.
Yeah, well, I know it too. Now, Aquinas' theology is heavily influenced by Aristotle, and especially Aristotle's work titled Nicomachean Ethics.
Therefore, to better understand Aquinas' theology, it's necessary to do a brief overview of Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle taught that the virtuous life is one that seeks the highest good, which, for Aquinas, was God. The enterprise of seeking the highest good is rooted in a life of eudaimonia, which is roughly translated as happiness or flourishing.
It's helpful to think of Aristotle's approach by using the image of a ladder. When you're born, you start off as a mortal who can strive toward a higher good, the divine nature. The process of seeking that good is part and parcel to flourishing and happiness. To proceed up the ladder, you obtain habits. You move in a direction from vice to virtue through habits and wisdom. The more you are perfecting life, the more virtuous you are by practicing acts of justice and habits of love for others.
It is this framework that Aquinas assimilated into his understanding of the Christian life. The Christian is born into the condition of original sin. The Christian life, then, is understood as seeking to be unified with God, the highest good. That process of moving from vice to virtue is aided through the grace provided in the sacraments. Participating in the sacraments improves one's habits and brings one closer to beatification, which is being in harmony with God. And God is understood as the greatest good, perfection. The concepts of purgatory, beatification, and the function and necessity of the sacraments are all rooted in this framework.
With this in mind, it's easier to understand how Thomas Aquinas' affirmation of the Fourth Lateran Council's teaching regarding the seven sacraments and transubstantiation reinforced the role and function of the clergy and the subsequent hierarchical institution. Aquinas asserted that there are both visible and invisible aspects of the sacraments. He maintained that the visible part of the sacrament is an instrument, and the instrument does not operate in its own power. Rather, the power of its principal agent, namely Jesus, puts the sacrament in operation. That meant that visible things are capable of working out spiritual salvation. Another way of discussing the distinction Aquinas made is using the terms res significandi, the thing signified, and modus significandi, the mode of signification. So, something can be imperfect physically, but because of the perfection of the deliverer, it doesn't lose its quality of perfection.
This distinction helps explain the continual call for reform of the Church and clergy, while maintaining the notion that the Church and the clergy are the function of the divine.
With Aquinas' theology, we can see why there was a regular need and call for reform of the Church. You can also begin to understand the central role the clergy play in the system.
More importantly, when someone like Luther came along with a radically different understanding of what makes a person righteous in the eyes of God, and the role the clergy play in advancing that process, one can understand how the Roman theology, the sacramental system, and the role of the clergy were flipped upside down.
Simply put, the Roman Catholic understanding that the Pope is the head of the Church, with the sole authority to administer the office of the keys through the distribution of the sacraments, shaped Rome's identity and the power and authority of the Pope.
When Luther denied the claim that the Pope has the ultimate authority to forgive and retain sins, the whole theological system erected by Aquinas, based on Aristotle's ethics, is called into question. This caused a major fracture, not only in the institution of the Church, but in society as a whole.